Yeah. So it's been some time. I think we're more or less over the storytelling stage of pen, but of course, I'm pretty sure that there will be, among our discussions, opportunities for you to get back into that and so on. So,
one thing I would
yeah.
start with is to avoid misunderstanding. I would like to explain the German exile program just briefly, or
Yes.
in more detail than I did before.
Yes, of course, yes.
German Pen received the offer from the first federal state secretary for culture. Germany culture is divided by states, but for the first time we got one state secretary for culture, and he offered Pen the dealing with and managing an exile program for 6 writers. In terms of rent, insurance, help from Pen in terms of bureaucracy and so on and so forth, and individual Pen members would help them wherever they were located to get through the whatever process they needed. So this was not done. This did not finance programs that individual cities started because they liked the idea of Pen, and they associated themselves in terms of asking for help if they needed somebody to fill in a residency or something like this. But the program itself was the Pen program itself was 6 scholarships in the beginning in 6 cities. Today it's in 4, I think. Totally financed by the German government. The other scholarships that had been organized, first of all, by the Parliament of Writers, was financed through federal European money. Those were cities within Europe. German Pen had only, of course, scholarships for European cities. The Parliament of Writers had scholarships in European cities, and today the ICORN, the International City of Refuge Network, which is located in Stavanger, is paid in terms of management by the Norwegian government, by the Norwegian government, whereas the cities throughout the world that offer a scholarship and invite people to come in pay for that service themselves. The difference between the European countries and most other countries in the world is that Canada, the United States, some Scandinavian countries have the possibility of inviting somebody or taking somebody under distress in and offering them help in the beginning, financing and so on and so forth, and helping them with finding a job. This is impossible in the European context because we cannot get anybody in unless they have a scholarship, and it is sure that they are paid for and for as long as they stay. The idea behind it was that they didn't want to invite persecuted writers from all over the world and have them stay in the country under the exile provisions. In many, many ways, we had to break through that because many of our writers and artists could not go back home. We could not find other scholarships for them, so they had to apply for asylum, and that then left them into all the problems that asylum application and asylum itself then brings, because in the end then they would not have enough money to start a profession as a writer, because when you write something you get paid a lot later, and particularly if you are a foreign writer in another country, writing a different language, having to find a publisher outside of that country, you will be waiting for your money for a long, long time, if there is any money at all in publishing. So we had to go the hard way, and we have found places of asylum for quite a number of our charges, and they have happily or halfway happily settled in the country of their refuge, which is always a problem. This is why the program with exile, the exile program in German Pen and in ICORN are so valuable, because they offer security and financial security, and also security from the secret services of the perpetrator countries for a number of years. In Scandinavia, somebody who is invited to stay there will get an office, will get a place to live, and once their scholarship is over, they still have their office together with other exiles, and the office is paid for by the government. All these differences had to be accommodated within what in the beginning started as an international pen exile network. We, from the beginning, were sure that we wouldn't be able to form it into a committee. But even the network is has diluted, because it's the Europeans with their programs and ICORN that now form the exile network of International Pen. That, I thought, had to be cleared, because I think you had the idea that the German cities were aligned with Pen, or they were only partners of Pen, not aligned, not really associated with Pen.
Okay, yeah. So I will go back and update the text for our previous podcast, because you're right. That's exactly what I had written. And even though the German cities, as you say, I guess in some way participated in the program, they're not responsible for the funding. And so my text shall reflect this. Thank you, though. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. As always, actually, we've got so many things to talk about, Karin. And in truth be told, we could probably talk about anything and everything. But it's always good to sort of zoom in on areas of sort of particular interest for you and as well for myself. I mean, language and translation, I believe this is something that you mentioned last time that we could jump into, and it's an interesting sort of couple of topics. I've also got some experience with this, because I also translate, nowhere near the level that you do, but I do some translations. I have done from Armenian to English, from Italian, and from German too. But I mean, what particular areas of translation sort of interest you the most? Because I've done work or academic style translations, but I mean, you've also done these, but you've also ventured into sort of literary translations, haven't you?
Yes. We have to keep in mind that there would not be world literature if there were not translation, because something written in Armenian will not be understood anywhere except in Armenia. Something written in German will be only understood by those within the German-speaking countries and those among those who learn the language very well. Because to read a translation of a literary work means you will be introduced into the front of language, which is the plot line, and the ideas and the culture behind the language. Let me give you an example. When in England you speak of a rose, what do you see in your mind? You see a rose is a rose is a rose. The independence of beauty, the independence, the stature of anything that is alive. In German literature, yes, we have some images of the proud rose. Don't be like the proud rose, be like a small flower, humble, and these are things that we learn as children. But in terms of literature or in terms of poetry, we have sah ein Knab ein Röslein stehen. Ein Röslein is a small rose. It's not a strong, courageous, beautiful concept. It's a small. It's like the small, innocent, tortured child. It's basically a song about the rose being raped, the Röslein, the small rose, being raped by a young fellow who is simply breaking it. So there is a different association with every word that we speak in every language. And in terms of literature, it's very, very difficult to translate because you basically not only have to know the other language, you have to know your own language intricately. You have to know every background, every association, and you have to know the same thing in the language that you are translating out of. And that's the difficulty, and this is why works of art are being translated basically every 10 or 20 years anew, because the time and the outlook toward the literature and toward the language has changed. And this, to me, is a task that I admire literary translators, good literary translators for. They have to be writers themselves. They have to have the imagination of using their own language as freely as the writer of a novel or of a poem had with his or her own language. I've translated quite a few poems from English, and sometimes I even dare to do it from French and from Spanish, which I learned on a superficial level, and I always felt I didn't understand the language. I understood the text, but I didn't understand the language and the culture behind it because I didn't know the associations. So I stayed away from it after a while rigorously and went back into dealing with English and German. In terms of English, there are very few poems I translated into English. They had to be easy, as I would say. They had to be not superficial, but they had to be on one level without asking too much of the reader in terms of association of culture and of knowledge of what was being talked about. These were mostly translations for friends who had written poetry about emotions, their life, the ideas of life, and so on and so forth. So in terms of translation, I'm very interested and as I said, I'm always afraid of picking up a book that was originally written in English and picking up a translation and not having read the original. So I'm still trying to read the original first.
Yeah, I mean, that's a particular tale, as it were. I mean, there are some experiences that I've also had in this sense. But I mean, you mentioned so many things. You the way you speak sometimes, it almost reminds me of Agatha Christie, because if you look at sorry, I hope you take that as a compliment that it was intended.
That's a compliment,
yeah,
which I don't deserve, but yes.
No, but I say it because I mean, you speak for 2 minutes, for example, like you did there, and yet 10 different things come into my mind. And when I read an Agatha Christie book, which was inspired by my mum, Agatha Christie's books were about 220 pages long. And yet you come away from that thinking I've read 500 pages because of the number of thoughts and ideas that she was able to put into those, few sentences, essentially. And I really think that's a skill that is lost nowadays. I certainly don't have it.
She was a good writer. She was an excellent writer. We have today excellent writers, but they're not necessarily the ones that become bestsellers. And that's our problem. This is why I never look through the bestseller lists to read. I go by friends who say, oh, you have to read this, or I read 5 pages or excerpts from a book, and I think, that could be something that really, really interests me. And since I read a lot of English books, factual as well as fictional, and I got away from a lot of German fiction, I now found 1 or 2 writers I really admire because they write the way that people should write, I think. They don't write formalistically. They write about life, and they love to write. You can tell from the way they're writing, the ease with which they write, how well they feel what they write, and how well the language is for what they are writing. And so I don't give up on writers.
Yeah, I mean, just to come to one of the things that I've got so many, but 2 or 3 things if I can throw you, but we'll do them one at a time. You said writers make the best translators. I think it was Stephen King who also said, I'm completely paraphrasing because I can't say what he said verbatim, but he said to be able to write a book, you need to have read and appreciated the work of others.
Yes.
Would that also be your take on things?
Yes, absolutely. I talked to somebody today whose 11-year-old child wants to write. She wants to become an author. And the only thing I could think of was read whatever you get in your hands, and read carefully and make your choices. She's in a writing program in school, which is lovely. I'd never heard of that during my generation. To read is to learn to write, because to read means you get a sense of language in terms of sound, in terms of rhythm, in terms of content matter. And as a child even, you find that's a book that is written with honesty, that is a book that is really using the language that is precise and is not commonplace or rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, again, in your words, something else comes to mind. There's a professor, and the subject that he is a professor in eludes me at the moment because it's not one of those common titles. I can almost imagine it. But anyway, he said that and he's an American, but he went to University of Oxford because he wanted to read his subject. And for him, this was particularly important. And that's one of the reasons why he chose a British university, was because he could still read the subject. Yes. And for him, this distinguished the way that modern universities were going in the US, because he believes that by losing this capacity of associating learning and knowledge with reading, we fall victim to being force-fed information and misinformation through the internet.
Okay, that's was not a problem at my time, because we had to read 2,000 pages per week at least.
Yeah.
And I was very happy that I started fast reading when I was very young. And I got all kinds of methods to go through a book a little faster than the others, because there are some tricks. And of course, most everybody knows them. So you read only left pages, and then you know what was on the right-hand side of the page. Another way of having your reading time is to only read the beginnings of paragraphs, or the last half of paragraphs. You can choose. And you also get a lot of sense of what is in the book in terms of content, in terms of style, in terms of language. So I was very, very efficient with reading, but I read constantly.
Yeah.
And that was an American university. I didn't read constantly at a German university. At German universities, I always felt if you could second guess, or if you could bluff your way through, you didn't need to read the original. You read a couple of articles about the original, and you could get away with that. And in the American system that I was used to, you had to read. You had to read the primary literature. You had to find the secondary literature to get another level of understanding for what you just read. And it was constant reading. So in terms of I always associated the English term. I read law at the university, which is in America, I took law. They don't use the word to read. But the reading to me was always an Anglo-American phenomenon, and not necessarily a German one.
Yeah. I mean, this particular individual did mention that, universities had changed somewhat in the way that they, produced, as it were, graduates nowadays, and he was very critical of the decline of standards in the US. His doctorate apparently was in patristics. Sorry, that was the subject, and that's why I couldn't quite remember it.
What are you talking about?
The person that I said who went to Oxford.
Yes, because, what was the subject?
Patristics, which is...
Can you explain that? I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I hadn't either. So it's the study of ancient languages, and also, I believe, it requires a certain amount of mathematical and scientific knowledge. So it required a lot of reading.
Yes.
So it's it was a challenging subject, he said, but for this reason he's very knowledgeable in a lot of areas, and that's why I tend to listen to some of his podcasts when I have the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there is a lot of research in different fields involved in his kind of study, which, of course, if that is done without reading and just with secondary bits of information from others, you can't really get into anything in depth or even in the breadth of a field if you don't read. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel that there is, because I have a complaint with not necessarily, it's unfair to say it's a complaint, because people should do what they feel they want to do. People shouldn't be forced. I mean, this is the world that we've created, or we've tried to create. Everybody has the freedom of choice and so on. But I mean, so many people don't want to read. They don't have the time. They don't have the patience. They'd rather do some other kind of more entertaining activity, or even lack of activity, if that's watching television and so on. But I mean, do you not bemoan the lack of reading nowadays by sort of younger generations?
It varies. It varies. It varied at my time. It varied a generation later, and it's varying now. There are kids who read a lot. There were kids who read a lot in my time. There weren't that many kids who read a lot, or not as much as, or not even half as much as I did. And my brothers didn't read either. And to this point, they don't read. Except Fachliteratur, that which they need to read for their jobs. And which means it's a very, very straight, narrow tract of reading. I don't think people read less now. First of all, they also read when they read their handies, their mobiles. They can read very fast what's in there. They can pick it up very quickly. And it may just be a phase of 10, 15 years of mobile contact continuously. It will vary when they get out into the world and need to find different aspects of what they thought they knew. So it's a matter of, are they curious enough? Are they energetic enough? Do they spend enough of their own time for learning, for wanting to know, for needing to know, for trying to get into topics? And I think there could be some help from the school system again. If you have to do research in depth on a little bit, on a little question, if you have to do your own research, you learn to read. You learn to find things that will give you the information. If you only kind of with a big brush go through a subject or a topic or a whole question, yeah, you can do that with Google or with Wikipedia or whatever. But you don't get the real thing. You don't even get the real questions that you should be asking. Because before you learn, you have to know the questions. Or you have to learn to find the questions. Because the questions are what remains. Not anything is final in terms of interpretation, in terms of knowledge. So it's the questions that are important, and the curiosity.
Yes, so much of what you say there has such great depth. I mean, yet to learn the questions though requires training, doesn't it? I mean, if you give somebody access to the World Wide Web, which is this huge electronic library, and ask them to pursue a certain line, it's you would see two very different outcomes if one were to do it just as a hobby, who had no specific discipline, and if the other had been trained in academia to pursue certain lines of research, as you indicated. It's hard to learn how to ask yourselves questions if you don't have a certain kind of discipline, to pursue a specific line, to reach a certain goal.
How many questions does your son ask every day?
Oh,
he
my
knows the questions.
God.
He knows the questions. We all knew the questions. We have been trained to forget the questions and deal with the product, not with the questions.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a study in France which, sort of followed the intelligence levels of a certain group of kids, and as the kids went through the educational system, the percentage of geniuses within the group diminished, quite starkly at every age level. So, and this isn't only limited to France, of course, it's everywhere. The educational system isn't built to service the individual intelligence of children. It's built there to produce a specific kind of resource to service an economy. And this is very unfortunate.
It has a double effect, because it's not just the school that's failing. The school is failing not just the kids, they are failing the parents, because the parents have given up the responsibility for teaching children to the schools. And the schools have not reconnected with the parents, saying, look, this is how we can together bring the children up to par. And there's a lack of contact and a lack of consequence. If you give up education to schools only, and don't get involved yourself, the life of the children is hacked in two. One is emotional and one is learning. And emotional is at home and learning is someplace else and is connected with work. So I have a very strange feeling that where the parents are interested in what the children do or learn and are willing to learn alongside, which now at the pandemia is forcing them to, basically, if they allow themselves to be curious and helpful as well. It's the common and community teaching and understanding that is involved. We have drifted apart, and we have drifted apart in the families as well. And many parents don't think they can teach their children what the schools can teach them. That's not true. Okay, I fought my father because he wanted to do math with me, but he had a different way of approaching math, and I was in tears every time because I could do it myself. That's not what I'm talking about. The support of parents when a child or when a young student has an interest, to go to the bookstore yourself, pick up books that may fit into that program or that you want to read to understand your children. This is the disconnection I'm talking about.
Mm. Yeah,
okay,
a genuine interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you are aware, I'm sure, there is, when you mentioned the disconnect that is there, I mean, the disconnect exists for any number of reasons. I'm not going to make any justification. There is also, an element of disconnection between, me and my children. I mean, one lives in another country, and my boy here, obviously, we have timetables at the moment. And it's only an excuse. It's correct. I mean, I have to reflect upon myself. I take some interest. I should take more. We converse. We should converse more. And I ask questions. I can ask more.
What I would caution, though, is don't force yourself upon the child, because the child has to grow too. To grow independently, even independent of your thinking and of what you know.
Sure.
That's not what I meant. I meant the support, that the support system is there if needed. And the support system has an eye on what the young person is doing, what they learn, how they learn, and that you can learn that too. Not to leave it up to the networks or to Google or Wikipedia or Facebook or whatever.
Sure.
To inform and care for your kid.
Yeah. I think my little boy is. It will be a very good German teacher because he corrects me every day when I try to speak German.
Well, he's quite a guy, I must say. Anyway, but if you look around, there are quite some guys and there are quite some girls around, and I don't want them to be crushed.
Sure.
By lack of interest on the one hand, and by overfeeding from the media. There has to be a balance. And I think one big thing is love, which is understanding, and which is also letting go and not pulling, but offering whatever you can. This is what I'm talking about,
sure.
And I know it's a idealistic way of thinking. I had some of these things. I was the beneficiary of some of these things. My mother was all support. My father was all support in terms of letting me do what I wanted to do. I don't think he understood very much of what I felt and what I was thinking, but he was watching and he was supporting, letting me go wherever I wanted to go. But my mother was there, always understanding and supporting with a sentence here, another sentence there. It was not constant interfering or constant communication when I was there or whether I was gone. It was, I just knew it was there. And that was the most helpful thing I could think of.
Yeah. I mean, that comes from a very, very close and intimate relationship, and it's one that I have forged with my older boy who lives in London. When we communicate, when we are together, we just simply understand one another, and I'm extremely pleased with that. And him and his younger brother, they also, when they're together, it's fantastic. The care, the affection that exists. And with my little boy here, I mean, he's just, as you've mentioned, he's a character. He's headstrong, to say the least, which clearly he gets from his mother. And so, yeah, it's a constant battle to, on the one hand, help to be his guide, and on the other hand, to watch him, as you say, make up his own mind. And he's very happy to do so.
Support and respect.
Yeah,
support
absolutely.
And respect.
Yeah.
That's one could boil it down to those two words.
It's a tough combination, but that's the challenge, right? That's
yeah.
You also mentioned something called interpretation. Now, I've studied a bit of law, and I'm familiar with the challenge that, for example, judges have when they come to interpreting legislation. And there are these sort of two schools of thought. One is that the judge follows the law word for word. And the other school of thought is that the judge takes into account the spirit of the law. When it comes to literature, it's a very different thing, being able to understand the spirit of what is meant, and then understanding, as you also intimated before, the words within the text, because this does require a certain amount of knowledge of the culture of the original text. Now, sorry, please.
I was just thinking it requires the knowledge of the culture, but it at the same time teaches you knowledge of the culture intuitively. If it is good literature, it will teach you what the feeling in that, how the interaction between people is in that particular culture, where it goes wrong, and where that particular culture suits you. That does not require any knowledge in that sense. No fixed knowledge of what the culture is that you're talking about. Because there's something like a human culture, which we all understand, and there's something like ethnic or nationalistic culture, which we are now learning more and more because people travel more and more. Okay, they usually don't travel for cultural reasons, and some never get in touch with the people that they're visiting, so to speak, or whose country they're visiting, because they stay in hotels and hire a car and do not have any contact with people of that culture, which to me is wasted travel. Wasted reading is if you cannot make anything out of this reading for yourself, if you don't understand yourself a little better when you read. I was just reading, or not just now, but a couple of months ago, books by an Austrian writer. He's talking about a world I know about, but I have not lived in. It's always the outsider. It's the not the elite. He's talking about the normal person. He's writing about simple life, and it touches you, and it threw me when I first read one of the books, and I've tried to read everything he's written now, and I'm so overwhelmed by, first of all, the humanity of what he writes, and the humanity of the language, and the humanity of the topic, and the humanity of the plot lines, and simply the beautiful language and the ease with which that comes through to everybody who it must come through for everybody who reads him. That is possible. It's not very possible in all so-called high literature, or it sometimes even is missing in literature, the humanity, and you sometimes find it in factual books. I'm just now reading in English Michelle Obama. I'm floored. She's my sister. I understand every word she says or she writes, and this is something that makes reading and writing so fantastic. You do communicate if you're really, really are honest and are precise and do not shut out either intellect or emotion. Then it's communication pure. And the German language writer I'm talking about is Robert Seethaler, an Austrian writer. I can only give him a big plug.
Mm-hmm. The name is familiar, so it must have been said to me by either Lena or one of my students, I'm sure. It's funny. Sorry.
One book that I love dearly is Ein ganzes Leben, a whole life. And the first one I read was Der Trafikant, about Vienna during the early Nazi years, and it has Freud in it. Freud is just about to emigrate, and the Trafikant is an assistant to a tobacco shop. It's wonderful.
The storyline is familiar. Whether or not this has actually been turned into a mini-series.
It has turned into film.
Yeah. Okay.
It has become a film. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So these are highlights. As I said, I read a lot, but if I were to pick one book in English and one writer in English and one writer in German right now, it would be those two. And there I'm very, very thick-headed. If there's a book I was told you have to read it, and after 5 pages in front and 5 pages in the back, I don't see any reason to read it, I'll simply lay it aside in the hope that something else comes up that's better.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to delve into fiction more. I really like my science fiction and fantasy because I sense the escapism is true in that particular genre, but I also sense the sort of the underlying philosophy which compares the ideals of the author with the modern world that we see around us. But recently I read a book, not quite the same as Michelle Obama's. I think "Becoming" is the title of her book, right? Yeah. But one by Kenya Hunt is called "Girl," and she writes a series of essays, and it focuses a lot not only on the Black Lives Matter movement, but also on her own personal experiences as a woman in the US and then in London. And there are also other contributors who also write different chapters. And in the same way that you said that Michelle Obama, you sensed, she's your sister. I completely understood every word that was written in this book. And it's a fascinating story. As you said, very eye-opening. There are many elements of it which remind me of life in the Armenian community as well, even though it's a world removed in many ways. But again, the similarities of humanity are there laid bare, and it's a fascinating read. So, I think her approach opened up a new realm of reading possibilities for me, if indeed they match that particular approach. So from what you say, Michelle Obama's book possibly does so. I may have to take the plunge with that as well.
She taught me to trust her, or that I could trust again.
That's interesting, isn't it?
And that's rare.
It says a lot. Definitely says a lot. Yeah. Okay. So these were the two authors that you would recommend. I mean, I know that your awareness of the classics is deep, runs much deeper than my own knowledge. Unfortunately,
it's fractional. It's fractional. All our knowledge is fractional, and if you, for years and years and years, deal with mostly German language literature, or then later when I was in England, I started reading lots of English literature of the 19th century, because it was also literature by women, which is strangely missing to a great degree in the German context. I do not, when I talk about the classics, I have maybe read a little bit of the French classics. I've read a little, very, very little of the Spanish language classics, what we call classics, the Romano-Greek period. Yes, here and there a little bit. it's really fractional.
Yeah, but there's so much there, isn't there? Really.
Yes. And
Yeah.
anybody who says I know a lot about or I know all about is a liar.
Yeah. I mean, when you mentioned the 19th century British writers, the one woman obviously that springs to mind is Mary Shelley. Are there others? I mean, okay, was Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters?
The Bronte sisters. The Bronte sisters had a friend, Elizabeth Taylor by name. I think Mary Taylor. Wonderful novel. Mm-hmm. You had Arnold Bennett. You had from Thackeray to Smollett a little earlier. You had Dickens. You had George Eliot. There was.
But these Virginia were male writers, or was Charles Dickens? Are you saying was a lot of his work was written by his wife? Was it or?
No. He was instrumental in bringing a lot of women's writing to the public by letting them serialize their novels. Mm-hmm. He did that with the Brontes, with a lot of women writers of that period, or a lot of writers in general. I threw in the couple of male writers because I didn't want to give the idea that only women wrote during that period, but there were wonderful male writers as well. It was an interesting time. It was a time of strife. It was the time of industrialization and the problems that came with it. And they are in all these novels, even though they're all love letters, love stories, or most of them are love stories. I love Elizabeth Gaskell. North and South, I think, is something that every English-speaking person should have read, because it shows the division between that is still in England, North and South, and what it means and what it involves and what it still involves in terms of lack of good schooling, lack of social services, and so on and so forth. When you go into the north of England, the country becomes colder. You could look at the towns if they have been developed in the last 150 years. They're cold. They gave me a big shudder when I saw some of them. When I went to do some research on D.H. Lawrence, and I went to Eastwood, I left it as quickly as I could. And this is something I felt was, during that time, was what they were fighting against, the good writers, against that coldness, against that lack of understanding, lack of compassion, and the overpowering industry, the overpowering Manchester capitalism, and so on and so forth. That I found in 19th century literature fascinating, and it's everywhere. It's even in if you read Jane Austen, this is before the Industrial Revolution to a large degree, but the problems that come with industrialization are already there. Because the women could not have really a profession. They had to wait until they were being married, or they could become governesses. And that element of society in the North was free to become factory women. They didn't have a chance before, they didn't have a chance during to really educate themselves. Only the strongest were able to really live a full life, and live a full life was only provided for the men. And this is what, in a way, fascinated and shocked me.
Yeah, I mean, to quote a line from Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I think that's perhaps in some ways what you allude to. The worst of times would be the reality that they faced. The best of times from perhaps this mixture of the genders from a literary perspective.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating though, isn't it? Because I mean, I see a huge boom in female and non-binary authors over the last 10 or 20 years. The book industry in many ways is, setting, shall we say, the standard when it comes to inclusivity.
I'm celebrating that, yes.
Yeah.
Because it is really has really come up during the last 20 years. When we were fighting for a women's canon, for teaching literature, there were no. If you taught German literature, where were the women? There were very few. Very few were known, and we were fighting, or we were researching into where were the women. They were there, yes, but why weren't they being published? Why were they pushed to the side? Why were they only the servants in some cases to their spouses, and so on and so forth, as you had in all of art? So the breakthrough has come during the last 20 years, and I'm very, very happy about it.
Mm. Yeah, and it's also fascinating. I mean, people always, this quota stuff and so on. But I mean, when I read a book by a female author or a non-binary author, you can see and sense and read the difference in analysis. There is a different voice there. There is a different perspective there. In some cases, a different pain. In other cases, a different pleasure. Yeah, and it's brilliant. It adds to the wealth of the reader's experience to be able to sometimes compare. But I mean, there's no need to make every reading experience academic. It's purely a joy. Otherwise we'd all just read the same writer, wouldn't we, over and over again, if we just wanted the same thing. And that wealth of diversity, it is fantastic.
It's really broadening, yes.
Yeah.
It's broadening, and I think it's teaching society, or it should be teaching society, to broaden their view, their perspective, and to open up. Society has to open up.
Yeah, and if it is to be done so through the writing of, as traditionally, shall we say, unconventional writers, then let it be so. When I was in Leipzig at the book fair in 2019, there was a female author. She was giving a talk. Unfortunately, I can't remember her name, but she said that the world is lacking in empathy at the moment, and the best way to train your empathy is to read, because you have to experience the book through the words and perspective of different people, essentially the writer and the characters. And I thought that was such a fantastic introduction to the world of reading for so many people.
Yes, absolutely. Reading doesn't just broaden the mind, it opens the world. It really opens the world for all of us. And this is why I was touched when this young woman told me that her 10 or 11-year-old child wanted to become an author and is practicing already. And practicing not just writing, but also reading. And that is fantastic. We should have more of those.
Absolutely. Karin, do you know, I think that is probably a wonderful place to end this current discussion, because it's an extremely positive note. And also because we've reached the 1 hour mark. Time flies with you, my word. But there are so many other topics that remain open, and indeed for us to, revisit this one. I love talking about literature, especially I love talking about literature with people who know so much more about the topic than I do, because I always feel as though I'm learning something from you, Karin, and that in itself is something that I greatly appreciate. So, yeah.
That goes both ways. That absolutely goes both. Any discussion that doesn't have the element toward both sides is a lecture, and we're not lecturing, we're talking.
Yeah, that's true. Though I'm shortchanging you because I'm getting so much more out of it than you are. But that's just how it is. Yeah. But yeah, Karin, thank you very much. And yeah, I'm sure we will speak again very soon. And I'm looking forward to our next discussion. Thank you.
I'm too.
All the best.
Thank you.